with Ward, WWW. I'm Representative Gene Ward, and I have the honor of being here to interview one of the, I would say, the best and the brightest, or one of the minds that talks about the economy. Everybody's been really concerned about what's going on with the economy. I am a little bit out of uniform in the sense that the legislature has begun, but to my left is sitting Dr. Paul Brewbaker. Paul, welcome to A Word with Ward. And I know that we didn't have a dress code, but I would take off my tie, except we got other hearings that I got to go to. So
thank you, Gene.
Pretend I've got my aloha shirt.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Well, before we get into what's been the economic trends and what they look like in the future, tell us a bit about yourself. You, for legislators, have been kind of the guru of how much money we can spend. You were the chair of the Council of Revenues. Tell us a bit about your background.
It's a small town, so yes, I grew up here, studied economics, got a chance to come home, was a bank economist for many years. And
Bank of Hawaii, right?
Local boy,
okay.
Yeah. Kailo High School. And for about 20 years, was on the Council on Revenues. And about half that time...
That's a rich history. 20 years. I didn't
Yeah, I know, right?
Wow.
Well, for half of it, I was hanging back in the weeds, so nobody would notice me. But eventually, I traded chair and vice chair with a couple of my colleagues. Nobody actually wants to be the chair, so we always make this deal, you know, if you'll be chair, then I'll be vice chair, and then we'll switch next year or something like that.
Why is that?
You know, it's kind
Everybody
of
wants to be Speaker of the House.
Yeah, no. With Council on Revenues, it's you heard the expression "shoot the messenger." The chair is the messenger. So
yeah.
it can be an uncomfortable position to be the bearer of bad news. Right now, it'd be great because the revenues keep coming in higher than forecast, and actually that's a really important point. Every business cycle, the cycles come and go, and we had a really bad back end of a cycle and the deepest recession since the Great Depression. I was the chair as we all went over the waterfall together. We all went off Akaka Falls.
Yeah, we were on top of you. In fact, we were very upset with you because you kept saying, it's not as bad, and it always comes back worse.
In that 12 months, we started out, well, it's going to be small, kind of like, Manini, like let's just call it 0, and then it was -2, and then it was -4, and it ended up -9. So that was, everybody remembers the moment when Lehman Brothers failed and the stock market went off the cliff. And yeah, I mean that's just the way things worked out.
But by statute, you advise the legislature. The Council of Revenues advises the legislature on what the state of the economy is, what taxes are going to be, and what kind of economic activities are going to equal the amount of money that we can spend. In the sense that without you, we don't really have a target then. Is that correct?
The state embraced the principle that the revenue forecast should be developed independently from the budget process. Budget process goes on within government. The administration has one. The legislature deliberates over it. The departments all submit their wish lists. But the revenue forecast comes from outside. And so that's what the Council on Revenues does. The Constitution and legislation that you guys adopted to enabling legislation wrote down rules of the game that said, well, if the council says the number is 5, then the number is 5, and if you think there's going to be more, then knock yourself out. Just explain to us why you think it's going to be more.
Yeah,
and that hasn't happened too often. In fact, the only time I'm familiar with it happening, the governor thought we were a little too conservative. And so DBED developed a forecast, and then we all had a meeting, and they essentially had the same. When we were up, they were down, kind of this, and then after about 3 years, it all equaled out anyway. So, but right now we're in one of these moments where the bad part of the recession cycle, the bad part of the cycle, the recession has been over now for several years. We've been slowly climbing out of the hole, and this is kind of the fiscal year or the calendar year that we punch out. Last year we punched out with tourism. This year, it's looking like, for the third year in a row, revenues are going to be higher, and not just by a little, higher than the forecast. And the forecasters, I'm not on the council anymore, but you can go look at their forecasts on their website, right, at the tax department's website. It keeps creeping up, and each time they make one, it ends up low relative to where things actually turn out. So that's a good place to be in the business cycle.
If, in effect, we went through the toughest economic times since the Great Depression, what were some of the key variables that turned us around? Is there much in the enabling environment, i.e. the legislature, that makes a huge difference, or is it many forces outside of Hawaii, which you guys always said what goes on in Japan has almost as much effect of what comes from Washington, D.C.?
In a sense, it's all of the above. We're a small, open economy. We kind of have, the global forces at work are much larger than anything we can do. That doesn't mean that policymakers, that decision makers in the legislature and elsewhere can't do things to help, because they can. In this case, the forces at work were much larger than us. And as it turned out, Hawaii, but primarily Oahu, which is 3/4 of Hawaii, Oahu ended up in better balance at the beginning, less out of balance in the housing market. So really the neighbor islands bore the brunt of what was a housing-led recession, the so-called subprime financial crisis, mortgage lending excesses and whatnot, were mostly concentrated on the neighbor islands. And then the other part of it, of course, was loss of tourism, which is pro-cyclical. It comes and goes with good economic times and goes away with bad. In this case, tourism's come back pretty quickly, or at least fast enough that I think it's caught people off guard. So we reached a peak of 7.5 million visitor arrivals just prior to the recession, when everybody thought their house was worth all this money and so on and so forth. And then we got knocked back to about, 6.5, 7 million. We come back last year was 8 million.
Well, what's the limit? If we got 8 million, that's 2012 you're talking about.
Good question, because we hadn't built any new hotel rooms for about 15 years, between the early 1990s and the end of the last cycle. Right at the peak of the cycle, a couple guys showed up, Disney, some of the timeshare guys, Hilton, Marriott, and built about 6,000, on top of the existing 70,000, about 6,000 accommodation units. So a nice little increment, which pushes the ceiling up. And that's actually an interesting question that's being debated right now in the industry. I heard an executive with the Tourism Authority say the number's 8.5 million.
That's the max, or that's what's coming in 2013?
That was his calculation. My calculation is 9. So, but the point is, we just went from 7 to 8 in the last 2 years. We can see not too far down the road that 8.5 or 9 million visitors is where we're headed. And when you get there, if you haven't built the capacity, it limits your ability to grow our principal export.
But on that very issue, I think you had noted, or one of the economists, and this is one of the preeminent economists who, even though he's not on the Council of Revenues, was one of the key speakers to the legislature a couple of weeks ago when we kicked off and we had to see what revenue projections were there. And basically you or one of your colleagues from UHERO or from DBED had said that even though we're getting more visitors, a huge percentage now have learned the game on Oahu, and they're not staying in hotels.
Yeah,
they're all over the place.
That's true, but the inventory is the inventory. So
you mean like you're talking about houses as inventory?
Well, it used to be mostly hotel rooms. It's still predominantly hotel rooms.
Okay.
Condos available for rental. Timeshare is kind of a growing segment.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And then kind of the fourth leg now is the sort of vacation rental market. It's small-ish, but it's been growing, and it's, I think, an interesting. It's one of the things is that it's important for us to think about, in terms of where it will fit in the future, if at all.
If we look at it in a comparison, Oahu is 3/4 the size of Singapore. Singapore has almost 5 million people.
Yeah.
How many people have we got on Oahu? 950,000 at the max?
Call it a million.
Maybe a million?
Include the tourists, yeah.
So in terms of the strategy in Singapore is crowded in its urban areas, but it has a spatial way of making it look like it's not filled with 5 million people. And Oahu being 25% bigger than Singapore shows that maybe your 9 million may be more on the projected capacity than the 8.5.
Well, remember, it's not 9 million here every day, all year, but it's about 150,000 to maybe 180,000 is the range we're in. Tourists present in the islands, on top of, say, the 900,000 residents that are on this island and 1.3 or 1.4 million statewide. So, it's maybe a couple 100,000 extra people. I think it's very important for us in Hawaii to make the observation that there are other island economies, open economies that are very trade-oriented as we are. Singapore and Hong Kong are perfect examples, examples from our region. that have achieved their dramatic economic success by allowing the urban areas to grow more than we have in Hawaii, but in a way that's more efficiently managed. So, you know, there's more high-speed bandwidth, if you will. There, you know, subways and tunnels under the harbors and that kind of thing. And in a way, I think what's happened in Hawaii, we've kind of gotten hung up. This idea that keep the country country is a very popular aspiration politically and, you know, I think socially in Hawaii.
Ag is in the Constitution also. Preservation.
And there are preservation directives in the Constitution for agricultural land, but there's nothing contradictory between keeping the country and making the city awesome.
And that's where you got to go vertical if you're going to grow.
And you have to go vertical.
You
have to go with density. You have to make the density work. You think about a tall building. What's their high-speed rail system? Really fast elevators, right? So you move people vertically really quickly. Our problem in Honolulu is that we don't move people horizontally as efficiently. You know, the train is one of the steps you can take. We can argue about whether this particular train is the one. But you know, that's what most cities that have achieved the kind of efficiency and mobility that we're talking about have
Two more
done.
things, Dr. Brewbaker, about the visitor industry. One thing that really hit me personally, and I hope when you hear this statistic that people at home watching this will realize, you guys said that every day that we have this many visitors, these 8 million last year, $39 million goes ka-ching into our coffers. That's how much they spend on a daily basis. Mike McCartney just said it yesterday in a hearing.
I'll take
$39 million. So when you see a tourist driving a car in front of you, I used to think, oh, it's kind of a nuisance, but when you look at $39 million into the economy every day, 24/7, 365 days, that's a lot of cyclical input.
I mean, it's our principal export. If this were Saudi Arabia, excuse me, if this were the Middle East, we'd be talking about exporting oil. If this were Silicon Valley, we'd be exporting software and technology. This is Hawaii. This is tourism. That's what we do. And again, there are aspirations to do other things, and it's all good. You chance them. That's my attitude. But the fact of the matter is, this is the one that brings home the bacon. And so managing it is really important. Managing it so that its adverse impacts are mitigated, and managing it so that its positive influences are maximized.
The other point I wanted to mention about the tourism that hit was one of your slides that basically said, yeah, we got 8 million people, but if you look at the amount of money that we're actually making on those 8 million, we haven't really gone ahead for the last 10 or 15, even beyond
23 years.
You want to explain that? Because that was a bit of a shocker to a number of us.
Yeah, so we're all accustomed to this as consumers because a lot of us lived BC, before Costco, right?
Okay.
And a lot of us have lived through a time when the big box retailers came, and so now people are equally as likely to go to Macy's as they are to Victoria's Secret, which is a specialty retailer, and to Ross Dress for Less. There's no contradiction. We do all three, and we shop online. And the consequence of that is that a lot of these retail channels, Amazon.com, have provided us with much lower cost consumables. The same things we paid more for 20 years ago, we pay less for today, and we get better quality. That allows more income left over to be spent on other things, which maybe we spend at Victoria's Secret. I'm just saying, it's all of the above is actually possible as long as part of the consumable spectrum is becoming better, faster, cheaper. The same things happen in tourism. A tourist, 20, 30 years ago was much more likely to eat in a hotel, at the bottom of the hotel, and as they are now to go over to Rainbow Drive-In in Kapahulu, right? And so we have a repeat visitor market that's learned where Ross Dress for Less is. It's in Waikiki, right around the corner from Victoria's Secret. So again, all of the above, and what's happened is the tourists, just like us, residents, the tourists are spending less in real terms, adjusted for inflation. And what happened was, in the early part of statehood, tourism grew very rapidly. And the fact that the tourists were saving money over time, paying less in real terms for airfares, the whole thing, was swamped by the fact that the numbers were growing so fast that we were making more and more money. And then we hit a point, and it's actually about 1989, plus or minus a year.
Now,
where since then, it's been falling. Because what happened was we hit the ceiling in terms of rooms. You can't grow the volume anymore. We added a few rooms the last 5 years, so we've got a little more headroom, but we're going to hit it again in a few years, maybe this year. And when you get there, this background effect of the lower spending cuts the other direction. If you have no growth in volume and outlay every day in real terms is falling, then the total purchasing power of what you're receiving in exports is going to be shrinking as well. So we've actually been doing that for 25 years. 23 years to be exact.
It's only now we're hearing the stories about people going to Costco and getting their food before they get the rent-a-car to go to Costco rather than get to a hotel before they get to their condo.
I have to tell you, it's very frustrating as an economist to have been watching this and talking about it for 23 years, right? And now people are kind of like, what, really? That's a long time to not pick up on it. I remember when Costco, when Waikele Shopping
The new
Center,
shopping center, yeah.
the one out Waikele, right, opened up. The developer, Dick Cushman, told me this story. He tried to get the tour bus companies to drive tourists out to Waikele. And the tour bus companies were like, why would a tourist go drive out to Waikele? So evidently some mom and pop tour company started up junk-along vans or something driving the tourists out there. And turned out, the Japanese love Waikele because they save so much that it helps pay for their trip. So I think, when did Waikele open? 20 years ago, right? So it's weird how only now people are finally coming to grips with the fact that we're not really getting the yield. We're getting more people, and we're having to deal with that, but we're not getting the yield that we're used to once you adjust for inflation.
But speaking of the yield, what visitor is out front in terms of daily spending? I think this is a new first for Hawaii that you guys mentioned in the briefing a couple of weeks ago to the legislature.
They're not my numbers, but I'm going to guess it's an Asian market.
Yeah, definitely an Asian market.
And it's a new kind of emerging market.
Definitely.
And you tell me what.
And it's Chinese, and it's $407 a day.
Taiwan.
No, it's actually.
It's actually mainland China.
It's mainland China, which, for those of you who realize we spend 40 cents on every dollar in debt, and most of that money is borrowed from China. These are the people coming here and depositing the
Cashing
money.
in.
$407 a day is quite a bit. In Japanese, I think, is between $250 $275, and they were the lead for years and years and years when my wife and I were retailers in Waikiki.
Asians still spend more than Americans. Now, there are a couple of adjustments you have to make. First-time visitors always spend more.
True.
They tend to be more wealthy and have a higher income
Only
profile.
40% of the population are first-time visitors.
And
60% are.
It's like 80%. 80% of mainland visitors are repeat visitors, so they know where all.
Maybe
they know
the
where all
60% is the.
It's the
total
overall
average.
because
that's a lot. That means they really like their vacation when they come.
Oh yeah, I mean that's our whole pitch, right? You came the first time, then you got Big Island, Maui, and Kauai to check out, and then Bombay, Lanai, right? So the idea is to get people to come back. But what happens over time is people familiarize themselves with the destination. They learn they don't have to get ripped off like they did the first time. So
and that's where this
they figure out
return is coming.
Right? How much is the bus? $250. Oh, bah. But as these markets mature, we move from a higher end visitor to a more middle market type of visitor that tends to spend less. The familiarity, right? The people, we see them over at Foodland and Kalapoi Market, right? Not necessarily at Alan Wong's, and so it's part of the. And then they buy a condo, and now they're coming out here for 3 months every winter, and they're showing up at the Rotary Club and the high school basketball games, right? So there's this weird thing that happens where we tend to discriminate or distinguish between residents and visitors, and there's this whole middle group, which is like part-time residents, a particularly large subpopulation on the neighbor islands. You want to throw them in the tourist bucket, except they own a condo and they show up at the neighborhood board, and they help paint out the graffiti on the, right? They're part-time residents. I don't know a better way to describe them.
It doesn't fit the image that we generally would have.
Well, where our the way we define things is sort of stuck in the 1950s, right? Well, there's Elvis Presley. He's a tourist, and then he leaves. But now it's all, you know, there's some dot-com guy, but he owns the house down the street from the other dot-com guy, and he flies his airplane out here. And he's contributing to the Aloha United Way or whatever.
And Paul, you've been watching this for 20 years. You've seen the cycles, the ups, the downs. You've seen the worst situation that we've ever had in the last 4 or 5 years now we're coming in. How about we project down the line into the future? What you see and what are some of the things that the people should know who are, you know, the 70% of the economy is run by consumers and what money they spend. What's the way for us to get out of this slow growth, and some would say not too certain future, even though the thrust of what you just said in the visitor industry is going to take us out, but there's other things that we got to do.
Well, the mindset part of it for the consumer is, let's invest in the future, because that will generate the consumption. Let's think about how we invest in the future.
What does that mean?
Well, for a lot of people, it might be buying their first condo, buying their first townhouse. So if a younger or middle income sort of couple that's starting out a family, if they're still waiting on the sidelines to jump into the housing market, they might want to take a serious look, because home prices didn't collapse here like they in Honolulu like they did in a lot of the mainland. Home prices got pushed down more on the neighbor islands. Again, there are worse markets on the mainland, but so in terms of the cycle, this is kind of the moment. In terms of the cycle, this is as cheap as it gets. And when the other side of the cycle comes, you'll wish you bought a house. Not to mention the financing is so cheap. You'll never see mortgage interest rates like they are now. So again, the point is, if you're just thinking about the next 5 years, not to mention the next 30, right? If you're 30 and you're thinking about retiring 30 or 40 years from now, dude, you need to get into the housing market at a moment of opportunity like this.
But Paul, you know that home ownership in Hawaii is at about 55,
it's
55%. The mainland is about 65, 70%. So we haven't got people in the housing
No,
market, even though when money was very inexpensive.
Sure.
We still weren't.
Let's be careful about that. It was 45% of households were homeowners until the whole subprime lending
I thought it was
thing.
in the 50s.
No,
it was below the 50s.
For years it was 45%. For like decades, it was like
home ownership has been that.
It was like Avogadro's number. It was a universal constant. 45% of households in Hawaii own their home, and then came subprime lending. And subprime lending at the beginning of the cycle put a bunch of single moms into townhouses in Eva that could have never gotten a loan before. But subprime let them do that, and then they built equity, and so we went from 45 to 55. I know subprime gets a bad rap, but it put a lot of people in houses.
I mean, that's good in that sense.
That's good until you get to the end of the cycle. Now prices aren't going to go up anymore, and they're at risk of going down. You put that guy into a house, you crush that guy. So that was the problem with subprime lending. But I don't think I'm guessing we squeezed as much additional home ownership in Hawaii as we can. It's an expensive market. It's a desirable market. It's a limited market. So it's never going to be a cheap market. You might as well just bite the bullet and get used to that. And by the way, it wasn't cheap in the 1950s when Tutu bought her house.
That's true.
So go ask Tutu, right?
It's all relative.
Ooh, I paid $25,000 for my house in 1960. Yeah, whatever. A car, your whole income in 1960 was $5,000. So it's all relative, and the point is there are moments to invest. And in the course of the real estate cycle, this is a moment to start thinking about it seriously. There are other ways to invest, of course, and I encourage people to do those.
Because we're running out of time, I want to get to the one which I thought was a key gem and a takeaway from your presentation. You said something that will benefit our future and cost us no money is a conceptual sense of about growing the pie. You want to expand a little bit on that? I thought that was genius.
We've spent a lot of time the last couple years talking about fiscal balancing in government, getting the federal budget deficit contained, aligning state expenditures with the revenues, the resources we have. And, it's a good self-discipline kind of exercise to go through that once a cycle. We're past the point where we have to be burdened by the necessity of doing that, because we're going to end up with, the economy's growing, we're going to end up with a little extra revenue. That's the moment to think about how you do more than just get taxes aligned correctly or get spending aligned correctly. Thinking about, as you put it, growing the pie faster, right? Getting the economy to grow faster, create more opportunity, business opportunity, job opportunities, and so on, investment opportunities, so that at the end of the day, when we push out through the 20 teens, we've actually gone farther than we would have if we just left things the way they are. And by that I mean policy plays a big role in that. How you accommodate investors as they aspire to build something or grow something or create something is really important. We spend a lot of time throwing money at the ones that we think are in the popular crowd.
The winners.
High tech and photovoltaics, right? But there's a bunch of guys out here that have great ideas and they run into obstacles. Those obstacles can be removed at relatively little cost if you do a kind of a carve out. I mentioned one earlier. Keep the country, make the city a city, right? Make the city work. Don't make people jump through the same hoops that you built to preserve ag land if it's down in the middle of Kaka'ako.
Dr. Brewbaker has a real formula for the future. Unfortunately, our future has run out. And Paul, any closing comment for 10 seconds before we sign off?
I'll just say, chance 'em.
Jansen,
Jansen.
invest in the future. That's for you young people out there who are thinking about that condo or thinking about getting your education or thinking about putting something away for what otherwise is not immediate gratification, but for something down the line. That's probably a lesson for our whole nation. It's a lesson for me. I'm Representative Gene Ward. Thank you for hearing A Word with Ward. We're going to have more from Dr. Paul Brewbaker. Paul, thank you for your contribution to the people of Hawaii and the economic thinking that makes for good policies.
Thank you.
Thank you. And aloha to you.